Let's continue our look at the background material for the Gospels by looking more at the things accomplished by Herod the Great. Chief among them, his major renovation of the Temple Mount, which he proposed in the year 20 BC, and he finished his renovation of the shrine building itself with the new 180-foot tower on the front of it. That was all finished by the summer of 18 BC. But he had other projects that were going on at the same time. He was actually expanding the worship plateau, and that'll take him quite a few more years. But on the north side of the temple complex, he was refurbishing the Tower of the Hasmoneans, the security fortress for the Temple Mount that has existed since the time of the Maccabees. And so this is what Josephus reports regarding the refurbishment and the renaming of this Hasmonean tower. And this comes from Antiquities of the Jews, Book 15, chapter number 11. Quote, "Now, on the north side of the temple was built a citadel, whose walls were square and strong and of extraordinary firmness. This citadel was built by the kings of the Hasmonean race, who were also high priests before Herod. And they called it the Tower, in which were reposited the vestments of the high priest, which the high priest only put on at the time when he was to offer sacrifice." So let me break in. One of the things that became a habit, starting with the Hasmoneans, was that the high priest's special uniform was always kept under lock and key off-site, off the Temple Mount, until the high priest was going to be the one actually performing official duties. And then he would go to the tower and put it on, and then come to the temple in order to do his work. All right, so back to the quote. "These vestments King Herod kept in that place, and after his death they were under the power of the Romans until the time of Tiberius Caesar. They were kept under the seal of the high priest and of the treasurers of the temple, which treasurers, the day before a festival, went up to the Roman captain of the temple guards and viewed their own seal, and received the vestments, and again, when the festival was over, they brought it to the same place and showed the captain of the temple guards their seal, which corresponded with their seal, and reposited them there. But for the tower itself, when Herod the king of the Jews had fortified it more firmly than before, in order to secure and guard the temple, he gratified Antonius," that's Mark Antony, "who was his friend," he's long dead by the time he does this, "and the Roman ruler, and then gave it the name Tower of Antonia." And then that's the end of the quote. So this is the security fortress on the northwestern corner of the Temple Mount. There is nothing left of it today. It was totally demolished. The only way that we know where it was located is because there were some pools that were associated with the edges of it and terrain that still remain. And so we have a sense of where it's at. But this was the place, more than likely, that Jesus was taken by the Romans into his trials and his beatings. It was probably in the Tower of Antonia. And then when Paul was caught up in the riot that happened when he came back from his third missionary journey, he was taken into the Tower of Antonia and probably spent some time there before his case was finally climaxed with him heading off to Caesarea on the coast. So this was an important place as well, and it's brand new or refurbished in the year 18. So now for the next 8 years or so, so from about 19 until 12 BC, Herod was involved in expanding the Temple Mount. And this can easily be seen when you go to Jerusalem now as a tourist. And again, I'm planning on going and taking another group with me in October of 2023. And I love going to the southwest corner of the Temple Mount because we can see some of the massive stones there, and we can appreciate just how much Herod expanded the Temple Mount in order to make it possible for even more people to worship God. So what he does is he builds these big retaining walls on the western side and the southern side, and then part of the eastern side, he just kind of locks it into an area that the Hasmoneans had already built, and you can actually see the joint between the Hasmonean wall on the east and the Herodian wall on the southeast. But once he's got these great big retaining walls built with massive stones, he then has fill brought in. And it had to be an awful lot of fill. And once the fill was up to the ground level of the existing temple courtyard, and that would be the worship courtyard, not the people's courtyard, not the priestly courtyard. So once he'd brought the fill and compacted it up to this ground level, then they paved over it. And then they started building these porticos, these columned, covered meeting areas all around the perimeter of his brand new courtyard. And so this is what we refer to when we're talking about the court of the Gentiles and the Temple Mount. It's all this area that was greatly expanded by Herod the Great. They probably could have got several tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 people in the court around the temple building back in the time of Zerubbabel, up until the time of Herod. But once he finished expanding the temple courtyards, you could have easily gotten 200,000, maybe 250,000 worshipers together up there in the courts, the temple courts and the porticos all around these temple courts. So he has really made it possible for some massive worship crowds to get together. When you start reading about the pinnacle of the temple, where Jesus was tempted by Satan to throw himself down from, that's the southeast corner of the Herodian expansion of the Temple Mount. And the reason that Satan took Jesus there is because from the high tower on that corner, it was a couple of 100 feet down into the valley of the Kidron below. And so it was a dizzying height. Now, today, when you go there, there's a lot of fill that's kind of gathered down at the southeast corner of the Temple Mount. And then they've built a road around that southeast corner as well, so they've filled in some more. So a lot of the depth that was once there is no longer evident. But it is, or was, the place where Jesus would have been tempted to throw himself off. When we read about Solomon's portico in both the Gospels and in the book of Acts, that's the portico on the east side of the Temple Mount. It's about a 400 cubit section, about 600 feet, that would have existed in the time of Jesus and in the time of the apostles. It's not there anymore. All the walls that you see on the east side, where the Golden Gate is located, and you'll see pictures of that, that's all later construction. That's Muslim construction work. but it was in that same footprint where Solomon's portico would have been, and that's where Jesus did a lot of his teaching and where the church apparently did its earliest meeting. And so everything that we're talking about in the building project of Herod contributes to the activities in the Gospels, in the book of Acts, and thereafter. Now, Josephus was an eyewitness to the Jerusalem Temple Mount. He was born in AD 37, so he's a good generation after the temple had been completed, but he saw it in its heyday, in its peak. And then he saw it all taken down in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So he describes for us the impact of seeing the Temple Mount from a distance as you were approaching. Apparently, he pictures it as approaching from the east over the Mount of Olives. So if you could imagine yourself being in that entourage of Jesus on the day of his triumphal entry, when you pop up over the top of the Mount of Olives and see, today you see the golden dome of the Muslim Dome of the Rock today. And that's impressive. It's amazing to see it there on the Temple Mount of Herod. But imagine seeing this instead, because this is Josephus's description of Herod's Temple Mount. Quote, and by the way, I'm taking this from the Wars of the Jews, book number 5, chapter number 5. Quote, "Now the outward face of the temple in its front," that's on the east, "wanted nothing that was likely to surprise either men's minds or their eyes, for it was covered all over with plates of gold of great weight, and at the first rising of the sun reflected back a very fiery splendor, and made those who forced themselves to look upon it to turn their eyes away, just as they would have done at the sun's own rays. But this temple appeared to strangers when they were at a distance, like a mountain covered with snow. For as to those parts that were not gilt, they were exceeding white." Now let me break in. Remember that this temple building was made of white limestone. That's the main stones that were used. And so they would have been in their highly polished state. Maybe I should describe that. Herod's builders have a very distinct design element to all of their stones. You can see this whenever you're looking at Herodian architecture. It would have a flat, polished face. And then there would be a frame chiseled in all the way around that stone, kind of a recessed frame on all four sides of the face. And those also would be kind of shined up or polished up, nice and smooth. And so that's one of the things that Josephus is talking about. He's saying you would see this brilliant white shining at you, except for the places that had been covered with gold plating. And that would reflect back super high gold light at your eyes. And so it looked like it was a mountain covered with snow, or in another place he talks about it being like a mountain that was on fire because of the gold plating and the white limestone. Now you want to try to keep all of that protected from the thing that is a plague to buildings, and that would be pigeons, doves. And so Josephus mentions that as well. He says, on top, it had spikes with sharp points to prevent any pollution of it by birds sitting upon it. Now, I've seen representations of this where the spikes look like little fat arrows. And that's not what's going to be the case, because birds would just perch on top of the little arrows. You should picture little needles, think of knitting needles, that have been grounded in little pools or seedings of lead. And so you've got these golden needles pointing up right at the edge of the wall. And that would keep the birds from trying to perch just on the side of the wall, where they would turn around and defecate down the side of it and make a big mess. So that was the way that Josephus said Herod's engineers made sure the birds stayed out of the temple edges. Now, how do we know that's the way it looked? Because when we read about the war that happens at the temple building itself, the tail end of the Roman-Jewish war, some of the defenders get up on the very top of the temple and they tear out those needle-sharp points, and they're flinging those down at the Romans, and they're also grabbing those little lead, they look like little lead berries that had been used to anchor those needles in place, and they were turning that into like slingshot shots that they would fling down at the Romans. So that's how we know kind of what Josephus is trying to describe here when he talks about the spikes up on the top of the wall. Now, Josephus also mentions that there were steps that went up from the court of the Gentiles up to the triangular-shaped area of worship, where the shrine building was located, where the priests did their stuff, and also the court of women that was in front of that area, where the women were allowed to do their worship. And so before you could go up those ascending steps to the temple shrine area, there was a dividing wall. And it had openings through it. This wall was about a cubit in height, so that's about a foot and a half, foot and a half. But it also had little warning signs. So let me read to you first from Josephus about this dividing wall. There was a wall of partition about a cubit in height made of fine stones. So it's not just a concrete wall, it actually looks beautiful. Made of fine stones, and so as to be grateful to the sight. This encompassed the holy house and the altar and kept the people that were on the outside off from the priests. Now that's Wars, Book 5, Chapter 5. There was also a notice written in Greek and Aramaic, and it said this, quote, "No Gentile may enter beyond the dividing wall into the court around the holy place. Whoever is caught will have himself to blame for his subsequent death," end quote. And Josephus talks about how the Romans gave automatic permission for any Gentile beyond that boundary marker to be executed without any Roman trial necessary. Even Roman citizens could be executed if they, as Gentiles, were found beyond that dividing wall. And Paul, one of the things that caused the riot that he was arrested over was because he'd been accused of taking Gentiles on the other side of that dividing wall. But it's interesting that when he writes to the Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 through 22, he uses this dividing wall idea as a metaphor for how God took away the barrier between ourselves and him, but also between ourselves and others, as in Jew and Gentile. So the dividing wall has been removed in Christ Jesus. And so I just thought it would be important to point out all these different things that we can tie in to the building of the temple by Herod, or the renovation of the temple by Herod. Well, next, let's talk about how the complex was completed over time, and Herod, in the meantime, is doing all the things he normally does that brings him that moniker, that nickname, the Great. So the shrine building once again, I'm going to tell you, it was completed by 18. But the Antonia Fortress and the temple complex, the expansion of the Temple Mount, that would all continue until 12 BC. So in 17 BC, Herod went off to Rome to visit with his close friend Caesar Augustus. When he came back, he brought with him his 2 young sons by the late Princess Miriamne. This would be Alexander, his 18-year-old, and Aristobulus, his 14-year-old. Now, these guys are of royal blood. They are of the Hasmonean princely line. He's had them in Rome, living in the royal palace of Augustus Caesar. Caesar has pretty much been their adopted guardian. And he's had them there for several years, being educated in all of the things that royalty need to be educated in. But now he wants to bring them back home again to kind of start prepping them to be his replacement, because he's in his 50s, and so he wants these guys to be the continuation of the Hasmonean royal family, which is now Herodian family with them, once he's dead. So they were quite cold toward their father, as you might expect, because he had been involved in the execution of their mom. That was back in 29, back when they were little kids. Then, at Herod's insistence, Agrippa, the number 2 guy in the Roman Republic, came to Judea for a visit. And Herod takes him all over the country, shows him all of the advanced building that he's been doing, the wonderful cities and the infrastructure, and then he brings him to Jerusalem itself and shows him this temple that's still being built in its courtyards, but he shows him the shrine building at a distance because he's Gentile. He's not allowed to go anywhere in there. And so Agrippa is just stunned by all this. He's amazed by everything that he's seeing, and he offers, by paying for them, sacrifices to the God of the Jews. Then from 16 to 14, Herod decides that he's going to go where Agrippa is at. Agrippa visited him, but now he goes to find Agrippa and help him out, because Agrippa is fighting in the region just north of the Black Sea to kind of protect one of the flanks of the Roman Empire. And so Herod goes and helps him fight. And at the end of that time period, in 14 BC, they're kind of wrapping things up, and some Jewish people from the region that they are meeting in come and complain that their rights, their special rights as Jewish people in the Roman Empire, are not being upheld. And so there is this hearing that happens in front of Agrippa, the number 2 guy in the empire, and King Herod, who's, for all practical purposes, is the number 3 guy in the empire. And at the end of it, Agrippa makes the declaration that the Jews are correct. They are being cheated out of their rights. And so new rules are put out that Jewish people have to always be honored in their rights as Jews. And some of those Jews included, they can't be forced to work on the Sabbath day. They can't be forced to come to courts on the Sabbath day or even the afternoon before the Sabbath day. They have the right to not be drafted into the army. They can be in Jewish units in the army of the Romans, but they can't be drafted. They can't be forced to violate their religious rules of kosher or dressing or anything like that. and they don't have to pay taxes in the 7th year of their cycle. Remember the sabbatic year where they don't work. So all of those things are reinforced by Agrippa, the number 2 guy in the Roman Empire. And so after all that was finished, Herod goes back to Jerusalem, and he gathers the people so that he can give them a report on the things that he's been doing over the last couple of years, and a report on how the Roman government, represented by Agrippa, are upholding Jewish rights all over the world. He also decided that since things were going so well financially in his kingdom, that he was going to give the people a 25% cut in their taxes. And so this is how Josephus describes the situation at the time. Antiquities, Book 16, chapter number 2. Quote, "So when he came to them and gave them a particular account of all his journey, and of the affairs of all the Jews in Asia, how by his means they would live without injurious treatment for the time to come. He also told them of the entire good fortune he had met with, and how he had administered the government, and had not neglected anything which was for their advantage. And as he was very joyful, he now remanded to them the 4th part of their taxes for the last year. Accordingly, they were so pleased with his favor and speech to them that they went their ways with great gladness and wished the king all happiness, all manner of happiness." End quote. So in the year 14 BC, things are going well for King Herod. And the people under his leadership are doing very well. It is prosperous throughout his kingdom, and it is well advanced, and everyone seems to be doing well. Now, there's always exceptions to that rule, and things are now going to start falling apart for King Herod. Come back tomorrow, and I'll start talking about that.